Hey guys, it's me, Wolf, back with another Stronghold Crusader build. In the last episode we built a brewery that now provides us with the most delicious ale, aka the golden elixir that numbs mind, body and soul to help our farmers in their fight against the struggles of everyday life. Theoretically speaking, the peasants could already drink the ale out of the barrels, but to make it in-game accurate we still need to make the third and final building to supply our peasants and soldiers with ale, and that is the inn. Overall, it's a pretty simple looking building. We can see a door, 5 windows and a hedge on the roof, as well as some barrels and a thatched roof. Just like in every Stronghold build, we're beginning with the main building, which reminded me a lot of the hovels. The walls are clearly the same, but the inn also has these stones at the corners, around the door and on the top of the building. In the hovel series I used plasterboards to make these walls, which worked really well, so I obviously used the same plasterboards for the inn. I began with making a straight line and cutting it with a box cutter, but then I thought, this seems kinda narrow. And we're off to a great start because I used the slide ruler on the wrong side. I cut a new strip off and I've explained this in more detail on the hovel series, but here's the short version again. This type of plasterboard has a brown and a grey paper layer. The brown paper layer is supposed to be on the inside of the wall and is attached more loosely to the gypsum. The grey paper layer is supposed to be on the inside of the room and is attached more thoroughly to the gypsum. We want the color of the gypsum for our walls, so we need to remove one of the layers, and I'm obviously choosing the brown layer that's easier to remove. I'm not removing both paper layers because that would make the gypsum really unstable. Okay, the next step is to cut out the door and the window holes. Looking at the in-game building we can only see the front wall and one of the side walls. For now. So I thought that the wall on the back is probably just a bare wall without any windows or other special features, and that the left side wall also has 4 windows just like the right one. I marked them and drilled 2 holes inside to roughly cut them out with my small saw and whittled out the rest with the X-Acto blade. I also began to draw the shape of the corner rocks on there because my plan was to make the walls thinner and leave these areas higher to create some fake rocks. I also left a small area higher below the window because it looks like a windowsill to me. After making them all, I checked out the in-game building again to make sure that I'm making these wooden frames around the windows correctly, and then I noticed that I can actually look inside the building. Now that didn't even make me mad this time because I found it out very early in the build. And yes, I might have wasted this piece of plasterboard, but if I hadn't been able to look inside the building, I would have had to imagine all the furniture inside the inn. And finding it out after making all this imaginary furniture would have been much worse. So now that we can look inside, we can see that there is one window on the back wall and another one on the side wall. I cut another piece of the plasterboard to replace the side wall and made 2 larger windows because in game they also seem to be bigger. And even though they seem to be higher up than the rest, I made them at the same height as the other windows. The frames around the windows seem to be made out of wood, and I still had some recycled garden fence wood left. On the previous 2 builds I didn't use these reddish wood pieces, so I wanted to try and use them this time. These frames are pretty dark, so I used my good old burning the wood and scrubbing it to make it look old method, cut them to thin slices on my bandsaw, and then a really funny thing happened. Because I didn't want to change the bandsaw blade right away, I used a ruler and the hobby knife to cut the wooden boards to the correct width. Then cut them to the correct length on my saw guide and glued one frame inside the window holes like this and covered it up with a second frame like this. Now that the walls are prepared, I used the Dremel jig to cut a groove into the side to connect them with a wooden board and some super glue. I also added some wooden strips up here for the roof because I'm trying to make it removable again to look inside the inn. The roof itself is just another piece of plasterboard with a hole for the hedge, and now that we have all the main walls ready, we can cover everything with the slow drying plaster mixture. This plaster is supposed to fill up most of the remaining gaps, and I'm using my hands instead of a spatula here because first of all it's easier, and like this I'm getting an uneven surface which makes it look more realistic. I let this sit for about 5 minutes and not let the plaster dry completely because we still have to adjust the color of the walls. I'm using this brown powder combined with a bit of water, and together with the undried plaster it creates a nice slurry first that dries pretty quickly and leaves us with a nice earthy looking wall. I did that for all the sides, and now we can carve out the gaps for our fake cornerstones. This is already heading into the right direction, but I think I have to add a bit more color to make them stand out more. But let's first carve them all out. While I was cutting out the grooves on the side wall here, a huge chunk of the wall broke off. I think I went a little too deep with this roof holding board, but to be completely honest, this was the wall that took me the longest to make, and I didn't want to make it again, so I simply glued the pieces back on and used some plaster to try and cover it up. While that was drying, I wanted to continue with the poles for the straw roof. And a quick side note here, just to clarify something, I'm calling this the roof and this the straw roof. I told you before that I wanted to make this roof removable, which means I also have to make this straw roof removable. But the straw roof is connected to the main building with these poles. If the poles were inside here, it would have been easier to make, and we could make one big removable roof, but I decided to attach the poles to the main building and only make the upper part removable. To make the round poles, I used this method where I drilled a hole with the diameter of the pole through an aluminum sheet, then drilled into 4 spots only far enough to create some sharp edges around here. I prepared the square stick that is slightly larger than the diameter of the pole by tapering one end so that it fits inside the power drill and making a point on the opposite side to get it started more easily. This step isn't necessary, but it helps to remove some of the material on the edges, and now we can make our round poles. You can see that I tapered the poles on one side because the walls are pretty thin, and my plan was to drill 4 holes on top of the wall to glue the poles inside there. After letting everything dry and coloring the rest of the walls, my problem side wall also isn't looking too shabby. Well, the entire corner here broke off again while drilling the hole for the pole, but I glued it together with super glue, and this is looking good enough for my standards. Now we can continue with the thatched roof, for which I cut 2 strips of wood to size and drilled 2 angled holes in both of them. Then connected the rafters with the battens, and on the brewery I used hay instead of straw to make the roof, so I wanted to make this roof out of hay as well. I tied the tuft of hay together with one end of the string and tied the other end to a needle to be able to wrap the string around the second tuft here first and stick the needle through the previous one, and so on and so forth. After I had 3 hay blankets, I simply glued them overlappingly onto the battens and gave the roof a nice haircut. To add the finishing touches, I still wanted to tie this white string around the roof and also add these things, but I wasn't really sure what they were supposed to be, so I simply wrapped more of the white string around the poles. And one more thing to keep in mind here is that in game it might look like these details are connecting the poles and the straw roof, but I obviously can't do that if I want to be able to remove this part. Okay, so far so good. Let's continue with the smaller details on the outside of the building. We have to zoom in a little bit for this one, but on one of the windows on the side walls we can see this crisscross pattern, and I don't think it's a blind but rather a fixed grill. I'm guessing the grill is there to prevent people from walking by and stealing dishes from this shelf, and if that's the case, it would also make sense to add grills to the larger windows on the back wall and the other side. Making them was overall pretty simple. I used some thin wooden strips and began by making a frame with half-lap joints that fits inside the window. Then cut some mortises vertically across the frame to glue more strips inside, and after that did the same with these horizontal strips. The frame is already fitting really tight inside this window, so I simply put a few drops of glue on the inside to fully secure it, and obviously did the same steps for the second larger window and the smaller window on the side. Now on the in-game building there's no door, or at least we can't see it, but I still wanted to add a very simple one, and I've explained this process many times already, so I'm gonna let the footage do the talking this time. The hatch on the roof is pretty much just another door, so I did the same steps, except here I glued a frame around the border of the hatch to cover up the hinges, and because it's like that in the game. The last detail that's visible on the outside of the building are the barrels on the roof, and I wanted to choose a rather hard wood to make them, because these staves are going to be very thin, and I decided to use this piece, which is a slat from an old bed. It is very bent and has rounded edges, so I started with making one side flat with the hand plane to be able to cut it on the circular saw. I could have probably cut it with the still rounded side as well, but to me it always seems safer to align the fence with a flat side. After cutting it to the correct width, I drew a line down the center and used a caliper to draw a part of a circle with a radius of 80mm onto the wooden board. I chose 80mm because this seemed like a good shape for a tiny barrel to me, so I marked lots of points at regular intervals of 3mm along the center line and continued to make the lines with the caliper. After making quite a few of them, I cut them all out on my bandsaw to make the staves. In the last episode I had to make 3 barrels as well, and there I calculated the geometry of the staves and made a 3D printed jig to cut the right angles on them. But I've noticed that these angles are so tiny that I'm just not able to cut them correctly. So this time I decided to simply use a bit of sandpaper to sand the angle to whatever seemed right to me. Also, I didn't even measure the width of the staves and was just hoping that everything would work out. After preparing all of them, I started with gluing them together in pairs, then glue these 2 parts together to get 1/3 of a barrel. I glued 2/3 together, but I didn't glue the 3rd on there to be able to still glue the top and bottom of the barrel inside. But before doing so, I attempted to burn the parts to make them look old and more in-game accurate, and that was just a really bad idea. Some of the staves broke because they were too thin, some of them bent really badly because this slat is actually just a few thin slices of wood glued together, and the glue always does weird stuff when it's getting hot. So instead of burning and scrubbing the barrels, I used one of my steel wool vinegar stains, which was way safer and easier to use, and the result was also okay. So now we have 1 ugly duckling barrel and 3 normal looking ones. To finish the job, I cut some metal strips out of the thin sheet metal and glued them around the barrels. Normally I also like to secure them with the tiny nails, but this time I really didn't want to risk drilling some holes into these thin staves. And by the way, I made 4 barrels, even though we can only see 3 of them on the roof, because there's one more on the inside of the inn. And there's not only a barrel in there, there are many larger and smaller details inside the inn. So let's get started with the floor and the inside walls. The floor is a simple dirt floor that's partially covered with stones. And I could have used real soil and stones, but I've decided to simply make a fake floor by using a piece of plasterboard again. I drew some stone shapes on there and carved the outline out first, and then removed all the other material to make the stones seem taller. Lastly, I covered it with the slow drying plaster and used the brown powder to adjust the color of the soil and the stones. The color of the wall seems like a light grey tone to me, so it's already pretty similar, and to see the effect the different stains would have on the paper, I used them on this failed hovel attempt. These two are different steel wool and vinegar stains, and on the rustier looking one I simply left the steel wool inside for longer, and the other one is just water where I put some scrap pieces of metal inside to let them rust, and I thought this rusty water would be the best choice for this building. While that was drying, I wanted to make the stone border around the 2 bigger windows, and it would have been more realistic to make the stone borders around the outside of the windows as well, but as you've seen before, I've decided to give them a wooden border and the grills. So to make the windows look a little more in-game accurate, I tried to carve the stones out of a piece of drywall and glue them around the window. A small problem here was that they had to be narrow and pretty thin, so they broke a couple of times while cutting out the hole in the center already, and cracked a little more while I was carving the rocks out. But after covering them with the plaster mix, adjusting the color and gluing them inside the building, they're looking pretty okay. Now we can continue with the furniture inside the inn, and I gotta give you a little side note right here. We can not only see the details when looking inside the inn, we can also see some details on the animation in the bottom right. The only problem I have with this animation is that Firefly took it from Stronghold 1 again. This is the inn from Stronghold, and for this building the animation makes sense, because we can clearly see the pointy roof on the top here. For Stronghold Crusader it doesn't make sense, because here we clearly have a flat roof. And on the animation we can see this resting place and a fire pit, which makes sense for an inn, but we can't see anything like this in the Stronghold Crusader version, so I've decided to not pay any attention to this animation and only look at the open building in game. The next detail I wanted to make is the counter, for which I cut some pieces of wood to size on my saw guide, and at first I wanted to make a frame like this, but making half-lap joints here seemed kind of useless, so I simply glued a slice of wood in between these 2 sticks to make the top and bottom, and cut out half-lap joints for the vertical sticks. Then I covered the outside with different pieces of wood, because on the in-game building it's also looking pretty colorful. And last but not least, I glued 3 more sticks on there to create the countertop. Next up is the table, where I began by making a frame with half-lap joints, but before gluing it together I wanted to try and cut out 4 mortises in the shorter ends of the frame to add the angled table legs. Around the table are at least 4 simple stools, and maybe there's a 5th one on the side here as well, but to make them I started with cutting a relatively thin sheet of maple and drawing one part of the stool on there. My initial plan was to cut out this part and use it as a template to have an easier time drawing the rest of the stool sides. But then I thought about a different method that was a lot smarter. I drew this grid onto the maple wood and each of these squares is going to be one side of the stool. This is working so well because instead of cutting out two half circles on the sides, I only have to drill one hole in between the two parts. After drilling all the holes, I can just cut out the squares, and now we have 10 sides ready to be connected. Glue one side on the seat, glue the second side on there, and connect the two sides with a toothpick. At the end I still rounded over the edges of the stools with the X-Acto knife and a bit of sandpaper, and just like that we have a table with 5 stools. The counter and the table were the bigger details inside the inn, and now we can move on to the smaller details, starting with the 2 shelves. The shelf itself was pretty quick and easy to make. I made 4 brackets with half-lap joints and glued them onto a wooden board. But like this, the brackets were looking a little too chunky, so I made a tiny change by cutting out this piece, and I like this version a lot more. And that's already it for the shelf, pretty uninteresting, but something that's more interesting is what items are on the shelves. We can see quite a few different shapes of pottery, and I don't know the exact name for every shape, but that also doesn't really matter, I simply have to make them. To help me get the shapes and positions somewhat right, I took a closer look at the shelves and drew this highly sophisticated plan. We can see that there are 6 different shapes that are displayed 3 times each. The only exception is this bowl, because there's one more on the counter down here. To help me sculpt these different shapes, I cut off the end of 2 nails and a bolt and rounded them over, and with the red air drying clay my pottery journey began. I only recorded how I made the first larger vessel, which took me about 3 minutes, and one of the smaller pitchers, which took me about 8 minutes to make. The more pottery pieces I made, the faster I got, but one thing that stayed slow and annoying was attaching these handles. I let them dry overnight, and here are all our pottery items ready to be glued onto the shelves. I managed to glue all the parts correctly onto the right shelf, but there were simply too many items on the left shelf, so we have 3 remaining. But I'll surely find a space for them on the table. And speaking about the table, when the peasants are inside the inn, we can see that they're holding mugs. And I've already made 2 of them for the brewery, but they were really simple to make, so I thought I can also make 3 more for the inn. I'm using the wood lathe again to shave this old broom handle down to an equal diameter. Then cut 3 pieces off and mark the center to drill a blind hole perfectly in the center. Naturally I missed the middle of the first one I recorded and hit it exactly on the other 2 I didn't record. But either way, I used the X-Acto knife to carve out the rest and taper the edges, and this is once again a slight change which I think is making a huge difference in how the mugs are looking. After that I carved out 3 tiny handles and glued them on there, then stained the mugs with the lighter vinegar stain, which made them look like this on the next day. Moving on, we have 2 larger containers in the corner here, for which I used the white air drying clay. I tried to get the shapes somewhat right, but these honestly took me way too long to be looking like that. But I thought they're still looking good enough for me, so I let them dry overnight, and right now they're looking a little too white, so I used a bit of charcoal to make them darker. On the in-game building we can also see that there's a darker lid, which I made with a piece of cork that I glued onto the top, cut the excess off, and once again made it darker with some charcoal. Before, when talking about the pottery, I mentioned that one of the bowls is on the counter, but that's not the only detail on there. On the right there's another pottery item, I'm thinking that it's just another pitcher that has these dark swirls on the neck, which I wanted to make, but I made them in the cheapest way possible. I used a pencil to make the grooves, and then I saw that some of the lead stayed on the clay, and I thought, well, that's looking good enough for me. And on the left of the counter are two barrels that are even smaller than the ones on the roof, and I thought, there's no way I can make them in the same way with cutting the staves and sanding the angle and gluing them together and so on. So I wanted to make some fake barrels. I used a wood lathe again and shaved the broom handle into two barrel-like shapes and cut them off. Then I marked the center, divided the top into 8 equal parts and continued the lines around the length of the piece of wood. Then I made a shallow cut in all of the lines and made the gaps a little wider with the X-Acto knife. Now the next step might not make sense at first, but trust me, it's going to. I used this steel rod and grinded it down to this shape to use it as a drill, because I wanted to drill a hole in the center of the piece of wood. But why didn't I use a simple drill for that job? Well, both types of drills that I own don't have a flat surface. The wood drill leaves a little hole in the center and some scratches around the outside. The metal drill leaves the conical shape it has. But we need a flat surface to make it look like a barrel lid, so I made this drill or scraper for that job. After that I cut the grooves a little deeper and glued the metal rings around them. And I think after covering the barrels with vegetable oil, it's looking pretty good, especially considering that this only took me, I don't know, a tenth of the time to make compared to the barrels on the roof. Now we're ready for the last detail of the building already, which was the most complicated in my head and the one I was the most afraid of failing, which is this metal pitcher. I looked up some images online and it seems to be a traditional Middle Eastern coffee pot, and the biggest problem here is that it's made out of metal. I'm trying a new technique this time, which is casting metal. For that we need to make something in the shape of the coffee pot first, and I used a wood lathe again to make this part, which is pretty similar to the hookah I made for one of the hovels. Then I took this wooden piece and tried to cut it in half to glue it together with a piece of wood in between and carve out the right shape again. This seems kinda pointless, but my plan was to make a gypsum mold from this wooden piece and cut the entire mold in half after it has dried. If I were to make a mold of the real dimensions of the part and cut it in half, I would lose the thickness of the cut in the center. Long story short, I did it like that and shoved it upside down into a cup of gypsum. Let it dry, cut it in half, and the wood was holding onto the gypsum pretty good, so I had to cut some of the wooden parts out. But here's the mold for the coffee pot, professionally held together with some duct tape. As the melting material I used lead because it has a low melting point and I can easily heat it with the blowtorch. I bought this 1 kilogram diving weight because it's the cheapest one I could find, and what's important here is to use respiratory protection because it does produce toxic fumes, but let's give it some heat. I'm really excited how this is gonna turn out. As you can see, I really wanted to avoid dumping it all out in one go and spilling it everywhere, but I was a little too slow and it hardened too quickly, so I tried to heat it again and fill up the rest. This is what it looked like at the end, and now we can take it apart to see what's inside, and it's actually looking pretty okay. And now sadly the second pour didn't connect with the first one, but I can still use this part alone. Let's just get it out here completely, and yeah, I think I can work with this. To clean it up, I actually only used the X-Acto knife because this lead is soft enough to be cut with a knife. I made the neck a lot thinner and left the opening a little wider, and I also left this little part on there because I thought it would make a great handle. On the in-game building we can see that the handle is looking completely different, but I thought this would also be okay. I drilled a hole in the top, a hole through the handle and a hole in the front to make the spout, for which I wanted to use this aluminum wire that is also really easy to work with. The color might be a little different, but I just used a bit of sandpaper to rough it up, and like this it's looking better. Then I hammered it pointy on the vise and glued it inside the hole. I also filed a groove into the sides here, as I thought it might make it look like the spout and the body were actually made out of one piece, but it's barely noticeable. And this was the last detail. I laid them all out again just to let you see how many there actually are. And now I only have to place them inside the inn. This was the third and final building of our ale production. I think I'm cracking open a cold one myself now while enjoying the finished building. And as always, thanks for watching.